Charlotte Evans wasn't poor, she was just perpetually broke. But signing a job contract without reading it would lead to a shock she never expected. The local newspaper's lowest-ranking journalist had just accidentally married New York's most eligible bachelor, and neither of them knew how to handle the fallout. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Her refrigerator held only a half-empty bottle of ketchup and a yogurt well past its expiration date. She sat cross-legged on her threadbare couch, balancing her ancient laptop as she typed up another local council meeting report for the Daily Chronicle. The words blurred together on her screen: budget cuts, parking regulations, waste management initiatives. Her stomach growled. She glanced at her bank account: $47.82. Rent was due in a week. Her editor had already rejected 3 of her pitch ideas this month, leaving her with nothing but mundane city council coverage that barely covered her bus fare. Charlotte rubbed her eyes and looked around her studio apartment. The ceiling paint peeled in long strips, and her window rattled with every passing truck. This wasn't how she'd imagined her journalism career would turn out. 5 years at the Daily Chronicle, and she still sat at the wobbly desk by the restroom. That morning, like every morning, she watched her colleagues hurry past with their designer coffee cups and pressed suits. Her own coffee came from the dented vending machine in the break room, 50 cents a cup when it worked at all. "Evans!" Her editor's voice boomed across the office. "The Garden Club story. Where is it?" Charlotte minimized her council meeting notes. "Mr. Peterson, I was thinking. Instead of the Garden Club, I found a lead about corporate tax evasion at the Garden Club, Evans. By 5. He turned away, then paused. "And clean up your desk. This isn't your college dorm." Charlotte slumped in her chair. Her phone buzzed, another overdue bill reminder. As she reached to silence it, her elbow knocked over her coffee cup. Brown liquid seeped into her interview notes and dripped onto her only professional-looking skirt. That's when she saw it. A job listing that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Executive assistant position, Ashton Industries. Competitive salary. Immediate start. Charlotte sat up straighter. Ashton Industries dominated the city skyline with their glass towers and commanded news headlines with their innovations. She'd tried for months to get an interview with anyone in their corporate offices for a story. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. The position required corporate experience she didn't have, but maybe this was her chance to finally write something meaningful. She could work from the inside, understand how these corporate giants really operated. Charlotte attached her resume and clicked send before she could change her mind. Across town, Nathaniel Ashton's morning followed its usual precision. His driver picked him up at exactly 7:15 a.m. His coffee, black, no sugar, waited on his desk at 7:30 a.m. The board meeting began at 8 a.m. sharp. "The shareholders are concerned, Nathaniel." Richard Montgomery, head of the board, peered at him over steel-rimmed glasses. "This merger with Sterling Tech is crucial. We need stability, a family image. Your reputation as a—" He paused delicately. "Well, your personal life raises questions." Nathaniel kept his expression neutral. "My personal life has no bearing on my ability to run this company. Times have changed. Social media, public perception, it all matters. Marriage shows commitment, reliability." Montgomery slid a folder across the table. "You have 1 month. Find a wife, or we'll find a new CEO." Alone in his office, Nathaniel loosened his tie. The massive windows surrounded him, offering a view of the empire he'd built. His phone blinked with messages from his assistant, lunch reservations at exclusive restaurants, carefully selected eligible women from proper families. He ignored them all. The HR department's daily report included a stack of applications for various positions. As he flipped through them, a misplaced resume caught his eye. Charlotte Evans, journalism background, local newspaper experience. No corporate skills whatsoever. Her application had somehow ended up in the wrong pile, meant for his assistant's position, but mixed in with the private matching service the board had arranged for potential wives. Nathaniel read her cover letter again. Simple, direct, eager to learn. A plan formed in his mind. A journalist would understand contracts, deadlines, the importance of public image. She'd know how to handle media attention. And most importantly, she'd be nothing like the socialites his board kept pushing toward him. He pressed the intercom. Send the Evans application to legal. Have them adjust the standard contract. And schedule her interview for tomorrow morning. The next day, Charlotte stood before the mirror in her bathroom. Her black skirt still bore a coffee stain, but she'd managed to hide it with strategic safety pins. Her white blouse had survived the night's emergency ironing session, with only minor scorching on one cuff. She practiced her smile, trying to channel confidence she didn't feel. The Ashton Industries lobby made her feel even smaller. The polished floors gleamed beneath her scuffed shoes. A chandelier hung overhead, probably worth more than her yearly salary. The receptionist's perfectly manicured nails clicked against her keyboard as she directed Charlotte to the top floor. Charlotte's heart pounded as the elevator numbers climbed. She clutched her portfolio, a graduation gift from her father, the leather now worn soft at the corners. Inside, she'd tucked her best articles, though none had made it past page 6 of the Daily Chronicle. The interview room door opened, and Charlotte's carefully rehearsed introduction died in her throat. Nathaniel Ashton stood before her, his presence filling the room. She'd seen his photos in business magazines, but they hadn't captured the intensity of his gray eyes or the sharp line of his jaw. He wore authority like other men wore suits, effortlessly and with perfect fit. "Miss Evans," he gestured to a chair. "Your application was interesting." Charlotte gripped her portfolio tighter. "I know I don't have traditional corporate experience, but I'm a quick learner. And my journalism background means I'm excellent at research, meeting deadlines, and handling pressure." His questions surprised her. Instead of asking about spreadsheets or filing systems, he wanted to know about her family, her views on marriage, her long-term goals. Charlotte answered honestly, figuring this must be some new corporate culture technique. When he slid the contract across the table, its weight felt significant in her hands. She scanned the first page: salary, benefits, start date. The numbers made her dizzy. This would pay off her student loans in months, not decades. Her hand shook slightly as she signed each page, too afraid to question her luck. Nathaniel watched her sign, noticing how her eyes lit up at the salary figure. A small twinge of guilt crept in as she reached the final page, but he pushed it aside. Business was business, and Charlotte Evans, with her wrinkled blouse and earnest smile, had just become his wife on paper. Neither of them realized that this moment, a desperate journalist, an ambitious CEO, and a contract's fine print, would change both their lives forever. Charlotte woke up in a bed too big for one person. The new house the company had given her was too good to be true. She wasn't even a big employee, but she got this. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a room larger than her entire old apartment. Her first week as Nathaniel Ashton's executive assistant had been a whirlwind of changes. A sleek black car picked her up each morning. Her new closet held designer suits she'd only seen in magazines. Her bank account showed numbers she'd never imagined possible. She padded across heated floors to her bathroom, still amazed by the rainfall shower and bathtub that could fit 4 people. A week ago, she'd been rationing hot water in a shower stall that leaked. Now, products worth hundreds of dollars lined her vanity, each one selected by the personal shopper Nathaniel had assigned to her. "Miss Evans," a voice called from the living room. "Your schedule for today." Sarah, her personal assistant, because apparently assistants needed assistants, stood in the living room with a tablet. Charlotte still couldn't believe she had someone managing her calendar. "The charity event begins at 7. Your dress fitting is at noon, hair and makeup at 4. Mr. Ashton requests your presence at the board dinner beforehand. Charlotte frowned. Board dinner? I thought I was handling his correspondence today. Sarah's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose slightly. The board expects both of you to attend. They're quite interested in meeting you. The elevator ride to Ashton Industries felt different now that she lived in the building's penthouse. Employees smiled and nodded at her with a deference that made her uncomfortable. Her new office connected directly to Nathaniel's through frosted glass doors. She settled at her desk, determined to prove herself useful despite her lack of corporate experience. A stack of papers waited for her attention. Charlotte reached for them, then paused. Something about the morning's conversation nagged at her. The board wanted to meet her. She was just an assistant. She pulled out her contract, intending to review her official duties. The first few pages looked normal: salary, benefits, confidentiality agreements. Then she reached page 17. Her coffee cup clattered against its saucer. Marriage certificate, the heading read. Below it, her signature stood next to Nathaniel's, the date matching her first day of work. Charlotte read the page 3 times, her hands shaking. Additional clauses outlined spousal responsibilities, public appearances, joint social obligations. She wasn't an executive assistant. She was Nathaniel Ashton's wife. The world tilted sideways. Charlotte grabbed her contract and burst through the frosted doors into Nathaniel's office. He sat at his desk, reading reports as if he hadn't just committed marriage fraud. He was just like every other billionaire, greedy, selfish, and just mean. What is this? She slammed the contract onto his desk, pages scattering. Marriage certificate? Spousal duties? I signed up to be your assistant, not your wife. Nathaniel looked up calmly, straightening his silver tie. I assumed you'd read the contract before signing it. Read the... Charlotte sputtered. It was buried on page 17. This is fraud. This is illegal. I could have you arrested. You could. He stood, walking to his window. But you won't. Sit down, Charlotte. Let me explain. She wanted to throw something at his perfectly composed face. Instead, she sank into a leather chair, her legs weak. The board gave me an ultimatum, Nathaniel said. Marriage within a month, or lose my position as CEO. They believe a family man presents a better image for the upcoming merger. So you tricked some random job applicant into marrying you? Charlotte's voice rose. Why me? You're a journalist. You understand public image, media relations. You're intelligent, presentable, and have no connections to our competitors. He turned to face her. Help me secure this merger. Stay married for 1 year. In return, you'll receive $5 million, enough to start your own newspaper. Charlotte's breath caught. $5 million. She could start not just any newspaper, but a real investigative journalism outlet. She could finally write stories that mattered. Then another thought struck her. A story about corporate manipulation, about CEOs who would commit fraud to maintain power. That could make her career. A year of playing wife would give her unprecedented access to Ashton Industries' inner workings. If I agree, she said carefully, what exactly would this involve? Nathaniel returned to his desk, pulling out another document. Public appearances, charity events, board dinners. We maintain the image of a happy couple until the merger closes. After that, we divorce quietly. You get your money. I keep my company. Charlotte's mind raced. A year of her life in exchange for both money and the story of a lifetime. I want it in writing. All of it. The money, the timeline, everything. Of course. He slid the new contract across his desk. Take time to read this one. She did, every word. The terms were clear. 1 year of marriage, public appearances as required, confidentiality during the marriage. Upon completion, $5 million and a clean divorce. Charlotte signed, her signature steadier this time. She knew exactly what she was getting into, or thought she did. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Ashton. Nathaniel's lips curved slightly. The board dinner is at 7. Were the blue dress Sarah picked out? She left his office with plans already forming. She'd document everything, the fraud, the manipulation, the inner workings of corporate power. Her finger traced the smooth surface of her new wedding ring, imagining the headlines her story would make. That evening, as she prepared for the dinner, Charlotte studied her reflection. The woman in the mirror wore a dress that cost more than her old car, jewelry worth a year's rent, and a wedding ring that symbolized the biggest story of her career. Her hair fell in elegant waves, her makeup perfect. "Mrs. Ashton?" Sarah knocked on her door. "The car is waiting." Charlotte took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She could do this, play the loving wife, gather her evidence, write her expose. 1 year wasn't so long. The elevator descended toward the waiting car, toward her first public appearance as Mrs. Nathaniel Ashton. She had no idea that the story she planned to write would turn out very differently from the one she imagined. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual charity event was full of New York's elite. Charlotte stood beside Nathaniel, finally comfortable in her designer gown after 3 weeks of etiquette training. She'd mastered the art of small talk with board members' wives and learned which fork to use for each course. A ripple passed through the crowd. The sea of guests parted as Victoria Sterling glided through the entrance. Her red dress clung to every curve, diamonds dripping from her ears and throat. Her heels clicked against the tiled floors as she made her way directly to Charlotte and Nathaniel. "Darling." Victoria air-kissed Nathaniel's cheek, leaving a perfect red lip print. She turned to Charlotte, green eyes sharp as cut emeralds. "And you must be the new Mrs. Ashton." "How unexpected." Charlotte extended her hand. "Charlotte Evans Ashton. Lovely to meet you." "Evans." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "From the Daily Chronicle? I remember your article about the local dog show. Absolutely riveting." Heat crept up Charlotte's neck. "Actually, I covered investigative pieces as well." "Of course you did, dear." Victoria smiled, all teeth. Nathaniel always had a soft spot for charity cases. Before Charlotte could respond, Victoria swept away to greet other guests. Throughout dinner, Charlotte felt those green eyes watching her, calculating. When Charlotte reached for the wrong wine glass, Victoria's quiet laugh carried across the table. The next week brought the Sterling Technologies partnership announcement. Charlotte stood for photos, smiling as cameras flashed. Victoria appeared at her elbow. "Your dress is lovely," Victoria said, loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. "It's amazing what proper tailoring can do for off-the-rack clothing." Charlotte's dress had cost more than her old annual salary. "Thank you. I believe in quality over labels." Victoria's smile never wavered. "Oh, don't worry about labels, dear. We can't all be born into the right circles. Some of us have to marry into them." The photos from that event showed Charlotte's smile frozen in place, while Victoria looked radiant. Headlines speculated about tension between Nathaniel's past and present. At the opera the following weekend, Victoria orchestrated her masterpiece. She invited Charlotte to join her in the powder room between acts. "I worry about you," Victoria said, reapplying her lipstick. "This world can be cruel to outsiders. One wrong move." She gestured to Charlotte's dress. "For instance, did you know that dress is from last season's collection? The society pages will notice." Charlotte checked her reflection. "The dress suits me. That matters more than its season." Such a refreshing attitude. Victoria's laugh tinkled like broken glass. "Almost as refreshing as your table manners at the Phillips dinner. Using a salad fork for the fish course. How charmingly bohemian." Other women in the powder room tittered. Charlotte felt their eyes on her back as she left. But Charlotte had spent years handling difficult sources as a journalist. She began studying Victoria with the same determination she'd once applied to investigating corruption stories. She noticed how Victoria always positioned herself for maximum attention, how her cruelty came wrapped in concern. The next charity auction provided Charlotte's first opportunity to turn the tables. Victoria had just finished telling a group of board members' wives about Charlotte's quaint background in journalism. "Victoria's right," Charlotte said warmly. "My background gives me such appreciation for real news. Like that fascinating piece about Sterling Technologies' overseas tax shelters. Victoria, didn't your family's company move assets through shell corporations in the Caymans?" Victoria's champagne glass trembled slightly. The society wives turned to her with renewed interest. "I'd love to hear your perspective," Charlotte continued. "My investigative background makes me so curious about corporate finance." That made Victoria shut up for a minute. After that, Charlotte approached each social event like an undercover assignment. She researched guests beforehand, remembered their children's names, asked about their charitable interests. Her genuine interest won allies. When Victoria mentioned Charlotte's humble beginnings at the hospital wing dedication, 3 board members' wives immediately complimented Charlotte's recent fundraising success. The Junior League luncheon marked Charlotte's finest moment. Victoria arrived wearing the exact dress she'd helpfully recommended to Charlotte the week before. "Victoria, that dress!" Charlotte exclaimed. "I almost bought it myself, but I worried it might be too young for my taste. On you, though, it's perfect." Victoria's perfect smile cracked. Everyone knew she'd just turned 40. Later that night, Charlotte sat at her vanity, removing her makeup. She hadn't planned on winning social battles when she'd agreed to this marriage. Her notebook contained more observations about upper-class politics than corporate fraud. A text from Nathaniel lit up her phone. "Impressed by how you handled Victoria today." Charlotte smiled at her reflection. Victoria had expected her to fail, to crumble under the weight of social expectations. Instead, Charlotte had built her own place in this world, one calculated response at a time. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the office to find a gift box on her desk. Inside lay a first-edition copy of All the President's Men with a note in Nathaniel's precise handwriting, "For a natural investigator. Your background is your strength." She placed the book on her shelf, running her fingers along its spine. Victoria had meant to expose Charlotte as an imposter in high society. Instead, she'd helped Charlotte discover how well she could adapt to any situation, a skill that would serve her well in the months to come. That evening, Charlotte attended another charity event. When Victoria approached with her usual predatory smile, Charlotte met her gaze steadily. She had earned her place here, one social battle at a time. "Victoria," Charlotte said pleasantly, "that dress looks familiar. Isn't it from 2 seasons ago?" "How sustainable of you." Victoria's smile froze. Around them, society ladies hid their laughter behind champagne glasses. Charlotte raised her own glass in a small salute, celebrating a victory in a war she never expected to fight or enjoy winning, but Charlotte wasn't done. Rain pelted against the office windows as Charlotte finished her last email of the day. The clock read 9:45 p.m., another late night at Ashton Industries. Through the frosted glass doors, she saw Nathaniel still at his desk, his silver tie loosened, sleeves rolled up as he reviewed quarterly reports. She gathered her things, ready to head up to her penthouse apartment, when his voice stopped her. "Have you eaten?" Charlotte paused. "No, actually. Chinese?" He held up a takeout menu from the drawer. "The board meeting ran long, and I missed dinner too." 20 minutes later, they sat on the floor of his office, containers of Kung Pao chicken and fried rice spread between them. Charlotte had kicked off her heels, and Nathaniel's jacket hung forgotten on his chair. "Mrs. Silver's son graduated medical school today," Nathaniel said, picking up a piece of broccoli with his chopsticks. "She's worked in our mailroom for 30 years. Is that why you disappeared during lunch?" Charlotte asked. He nodded. "Her husband passed last year. I wanted to make sure someone was there to take photos." Charlotte watched him eat, remembering how that morning he'd helped Ellen, a retiring secretary, carry boxes to her car. No cameras, no publicity, just quiet kindness when he thought no one was looking. Their late dinners became a habit. Chinese on Mondays, Thai on Wednesdays, pizza when deadlines kept them past midnight. One evening, as they shared spring rolls, an elderly janitor came in to empty the trash. "George?" Nathaniel stood up. "How's Annie? Did the treatment work?" The old man's face lit up. "The doctors say she's responding well. That specialist you recommended, we could never thank you enough." After George left, Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "You helped him find a doctor?" "Annie has a rare form of cancer. Their insurance wouldn't cover the specialist." Nathaniel shrugged, but Charlotte noticed how he avoided her eyes. It was a simple referral. Later that week, Charlotte discovered the truth from Sarah. Nathaniel had paid for the entire treatment anonymously. The same way he funded the children's wing at Metropolitan Hospital, the scholarship program for low-income students, the food bank that fed thousands. One rainy Friday, Charlotte found him staring out his office window, an old newspaper clipping in his hands. The headline read, "Ashton Sr. flees country amid embezzlement allegations." "He took everything," Nathaniel said quietly. "The company pension fund, employees' savings, even my college fund. Left my mother with nothing but debt and shame." Charlotte sat beside him on the leather couch. "How old were you?" 17. "Mother had to sell our house, worked 2 jobs. I got into Harvard on scholarship, worked nights to help pay bills." His hands trembled slightly. "The day I graduated, I promised myself I'd rebuild everything he destroyed. Pay back every person he cheated. Is that why you fund all these programs? To make up for what he did?" Nathaniel folded the clipping carefully. "I know what it's like to feel helpless, to watch someone you love suffer because they can't afford help. I never want anyone at this company to feel that way." Charlotte thought of her own childhood. Her father's small-town newspaper crusading against local corruption until bigger papers drove it out of business. "My dad was the same way. He believed journalism could change lives, expose truth, help people. Even when the paper was failing, he kept investigating stories that mattered." "What happened to the paper?" "Closed down my senior year of high school. Dad had to sell everything, take a job writing advertisement copy." She smiled sadly. "He still clips every article I write, even the garden club reviews." Their conversations flowed easier after that night. Charlotte told him about her first investigative piece in college, exposing cafeteria health violations. Nathaniel shared stories about rebuilding the company, repaying old debts, finding ways to help without taking credit. One evening, going through old company records for her story, Charlotte found something unexpected, a list of former employees from his father's time. Next to each name was a note: pension restored, college fund replaced, medical bills paid. Every person his father had cheated made whole again. She looked across their scattered takeout containers at Nathaniel, who was reading reports with total concentration, his forehead creased slightly. The man she'd planned to expose in her story had spent years quietly fixing his father's wrongs. The next morning, Charlotte arrived early to find Sarah organizing stacks of letters on her desk. "What are these?" "Monthly updates," Sarah explained, "from all the programs Mr. Ashton funds. Hospital reports, scholarship recipient letters, grant proposals. He reads every one." Charlotte picked up a crayon drawing from a child at the hospital. "Thank you for making me better," it read in wobbly letters. She thought of her notebook filled with investigative notes, her plans for an exposé. The story she'd thought she'd write felt hollow now. That evening they ordered Italian. Charlotte watched Nathaniel read a thank you letter from a scholarship student while eating his pasta, his usual stern expression softened by a small smile. "Why do you keep it all anonymous?" she asked. "The donations, the programs, it would help the company's image." Nathaniel set down the letter. "Good deeds done for publicity aren't really good deeds. They're transactions." He paused. My father taught me that everything can be bought. I wanted to prove him wrong. Charlotte nodded, understanding. In their private moments, away from board meetings and charity events, she discovered a different kind of story. One about redemption, about a man determined to right old wrongs without seeking credit. The city lights twinkled beyond his office windows as they finished their meal. Charlotte realized she'd stopped taking notes for her exposé weeks ago. The real story wasn't about corporate manipulation or power plays. It was about quiet acts of kindness, about healing old wounds, about two people who found understanding in unexpected places. The morning started with coffee stains on important documents. Charlotte rushed to print new copies for the merger meeting, her heel catching on the office carpet as she hurried. She steadied herself against her desk, knocking over a stack of papers, her notebook among them. The notebook fell open, pages fluttering. Her handwritten notes about the marriage contract, her plans for the exposé, scattered across the floor. As she gathered them, a shadow fell across the papers. My. Victoria stood in the doorway, a manila envelope in her manicured hands. What an interesting read. Charlotte's stomach dropped. Those are private notes. Private? Or proof of fraud? Victoria stepped into the office, closing the door. Marriage fraud, specifically. I wonder what the board would think about their CEO's fake wife planning to expose the company. Charlotte stood, gripping her notebook. What do you want, Victoria? Want? I'm just concerned about the company's welfare. Victoria's red lips curved upward. The merger vote is in 3 days. Imagine the headlines. Ashton Industries CEO caught in marriage scandal. Fraud at the heart of Sterling Ashton merger. Through the frosted glass, Charlotte saw Nathaniel in his office, reviewing merger documents with his legal team. 5,000 jobs depended on this deal. Pension funds, medical benefits, families who remembered all too well what happened when the last Ashton betrayed their trust. Victoria leaned against Charlotte's desk. You know what's delicious? He trusts you now. I've watched you too, the private dinners, the little touches, the way he lets his guard down. Finding out about your planned exposé will destroy him. You don't care about Nathaniel, Charlotte said. You never did. No, but I care about watching him fall. Did you know he ended our engagement because I leaked company information to the press? Victoria examined her perfect nails. He called me opportunistic, untrustworthy. Now look who he married. Charlotte thought of George the janitor, of Annie's cancer treatments, of scholarship students and hospital wings and quiet acts of redemption. Her exposé wouldn't just hurt Nathaniel, it would undo years of secret good works. I'm going to tell him, Victoria announced. Right now. I have copies of everything. Your notes, your draft article, your real background check. I'll show him exactly who he married. Charlotte grabbed Victoria's arm. Wait! Too late! Victoria pulled away. You had your chance to be the perfect corporate wife. Time to face the consequences. Charlotte watched helplessly as Victoria strode into Nathaniel's office. The legal team filed out, leaving them alone. Through the glass, she saw Victoria hand him the envelope. Saw him open it, his expression unchanging as he read. When he looked up, his eyes met Charlotte's through the glass. The warmth she'd grown used to vanished, replaced by the cold mask she'd seen in their first meeting. He pressed the intercom button. Charlotte, come in, please. Her legs felt wooden as she walked into his office. Victoria perched on the edge of his desk, triumphant. Is this true? Nathaniel held up her notes. You plan to expose our arrangement? Yes, Charlotte said. No point lying now. When we first married. But things changed. Changed? His laugh held no humor. You've been gathering information this whole time. Every conversation, every private moment, research for your story. It started that way, Charlotte admitted. But I stopped writing weeks ago. I saw who you really are, what you do for people. What I do? He stood abruptly. You mean the programs you plan to expose? The anonymous donations you wanted to twist into some corporate conspiracy? Victoria smirked. She's a journalist, darling. They only care about the story. Charlotte stepped forward. That's not true. Nathaniel, look at my notes. The recent ones. I haven't written anything about the company in weeks. Because you were waiting for the merger, Victoria cut in. Maximum damage, right? Just like I did. Nathaniel's hands shook as he shuffled through the papers. Charlotte saw the moment he found her recent entries. Observations about his kindness, his quiet strength, his determination to right his father's wrongs. Get out, he said quietly. Both of you, Victoria protested, but dash. Out! In the hallway, Victoria grabbed Charlotte's arm. Well done. You've managed to ruin everything. No, Charlotte said. You did that years ago, and you'll do it again, because you can't stand that he became someone better than you could ever be. She pulled free and walked to her office, gathering her things. Through the glass, she saw Nathaniel standing at his window, shoulders rigid. On her desk, the crayon drawing from the hospital child still sat in its frame. Charlotte picked up her notebook, the source of all this chaos. Its pages held two stories, the exposé she'd planned to write, and the truth she'd discovered instead. She'd come looking for corporate scandal and found redemption, sought corruption and found healing. She wrote one last entry. The real story was never about fraud or mergers. It's about a man who turned his father's legacy of greed into a mission of quiet redemption, who taught me that true change happens in small moments, in hospital rooms and scholarship letters and anonymous kindnesses. I came to write about corruption. Instead, I found hope. Charlotte left the notebook on Nathaniel's desk. Whether he read it or not, he deserved to know the whole truth. The merger, the jobs, the good works he'd spent years building, they mattered more than any story she could write. As the elevator descended, Charlotte thought of all the quiet moments they'd shared over takeout dinners. How his eyes crinkled when he really smiled. How he remembered every employee's name, every family story, every small detail that made them human. She'd wanted to expose secrets. Instead, she'd learned that the biggest stories aren't always the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're written in small acts of kindness, in choices made when no one is watching, in the quiet spaces between who we are and who we choose to become. Charlotte sat at her laptop at 3 a.m., cursor blinking on her finished article. Months of investigation, interviews, and observations filled her screen. The story would make her career, a tale of corporate manipulation, marriage fraud, and power plays at the highest levels of business. Her finger hovered over the delete key. Through her penthouse windows, the city sparkled below, the Ashton Industries logo bright against the night sky. In 12 hours, the merger signing would seal the company's future. She thought of the hospital wing filled with children's laughter, of scholarship students pursuing their dreams, of Annie receiving her cancer treatments. Her article would expose Nathaniel's anonymous donations, turn acts of kindness into corporate scandal. Charlotte pressed delete, then emptied the trash folder, then reformatted her hard drive. When dawn broke, she packed a small bag. Her designer clothes stayed in the closet. They belonged to Mrs. Ashton, not Charlotte Evans. She kept only what she'd brought to this marriage: her worn leather portfolio, her father's old newspaper clippings, and the truth of who she really was. The merger signing ceremony filled the company's grand conference room. Board members in expensive suits mingled with Sterling Technologies executives. Cameras flashed as Nathaniel entered, his silver tie perfect, his expression controlled. Charlotte slipped in quietly, taking a seat in the back. She hadn't planned to come, but she owed him the courtesy of returning her wedding ring in person. After the signing, she would leave him to repair the damage her almost expose had caused. Richard Montgomery, head of the board, stepped up to the podium. Today marks a historic moment for Ashton Industries. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victoria Sterling strode into the room, manila envelope in hand. Her red dress commanded attention, her heels clicking against the floors as she approached the podium. "I apologize for interrupting," Victoria said, voice dripping honey. "But before we proceed, there's something the board should know about our beloved CEO and his wife." Charlotte's heart hammered. She should leave now, before Victoria destroyed everything. But her feet wouldn't move. "Nathaniel Ashton's marriage is a fraud," Victoria announced. "His wife is an undercover journalist who planned to expose this company's secrets. I have proof, her notes, her draft article, everything." The room erupted in whispers. Board members exchanged glances. Cameras turned toward Charlotte. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, "the marriage itself was orchestrated to deceive this board. A contract disguised as employment papers, signed by an unsuspecting journalist to meet your marriage ultimatum." Montgomery turned to Nathaniel. "Is this true?" Charlotte stood. She could salvage this, confess to acting alone, protect the merger. But Nathaniel spoke first. "Yes." His voice carried across the silent room. "The marriage began as a business arrangement." Victoria smiled triumphantly. "You see? He admits to defrauding his own board dash." "I'm not finished." Nathaniel loosened his tie, something Charlotte had only seen him do during their private dinners. "I did arrange this marriage to satisfy the board's ultimatum. I chose Charlotte because she was different from anyone in our corporate world. I expected a business transaction. Instead," he turned to face Charlotte. "Instead, I found someone who saw past my title to the person beneath, who challenged me to be better, who taught me that true strength lies not in power, but in trust." Victoria's smile faltered. "She planned to expose you, to destroy everything you built." "No." Charlotte stepped forward. "I planned to write a story about corporate manipulation. But I found a different story, one about redemption, about a man who spent years quietly fixing his father's wrongs, about anonymous kindnesses and lives changed without seeking credit." Nathaniel walked toward her. "I read your notebook, the real story you discovered." "I deleted it," Charlotte said. "All of it. Some stories matter more than headlines." "The merger," Montgomery interrupted. "The jobs at stake are more important than my position," Nathaniel said. He faced the board. "If you want my resignation, you'll have it. But I won't deny what this marriage has become. I won't lose the woman who taught me to trust again, even if it costs me the company." Victoria slammed her envelope down. "This is ridiculous. She's a nobody, a journalist who couldn't even make the front page dash. She's my wife." Nathaniel's voice steel. "Not by contract now, but by choice. Every good thing this company has done, the hospital wing, the scholarships, the employee programs, she understood their true value. She chose protecting those over her story." He turned to Montgomery. "You wanted a stable family image. Well, here's the truth. I love my wife. I choose her over this merger, over this company, over everything. Fire me if you must, but know that you'll lose the best decision I ever made." Charlotte's eyes stung. The ring in her pocket felt heavy. When had their pretense become reality? Montgomery cleared his throat. "The board will need to discuss this." "No." A new voice spoke. Harold Sterling, Victoria's father and CEO of Sterling Technologies, stood. "The merger proceeds. Victoria World." "Father, a man who chooses integrity over power?" Harold said. "Who admits his mistakes and values loyalty above profit. That's exactly the kind of leader we want as partners." He glared at Victoria. "Unlike some who value personal vengeance over business sense." The room buzzed with conversation. Cameras flashed. Charlotte felt Nathaniel's hand find hers, warm and real. "There will be conditions," Montgomery said. "Full disclosure of all charitable programs, proper documentation dash." "Agreed," Nathaniel said. "No more secrets." Later that night, they stood in his office surrounded by takeout containers, just like always. Charlotte pulled out her wedding ring. I was going to return this, she said. Start fresh as myself, not Mrs. Ashton. Nathaniel took the ring. I have a better idea. He knelt on one knee. Charlotte Evans, investigative journalist who stole my heart while almost exposing my company. Will you marry me? For real this time? Charlotte laughed through tears. You do realize this story will get out. The press will have a field day. Let them. He slid the ring back on her finger. It's a better story than any exposé. The merger celebration transformed the Ashton Industries rooftop into an enchanted garden. White roses climbed trellises, fairy lights twinkled overhead, and champagne flowed freely. Charlotte stood at the edge, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold. Her press badge from the Daily Chronicle hung framed in their penthouse now, a reminder of where their story began. Your article goes to print tomorrow? Nathaniel appeared beside her, offering a glass of champagne. Charlotte nodded. The editors still can't believe I chose to write about the hospital wing opening instead of our marriage scandal. The children's ward matters more than our love life. He smiled. Though I notice you mentioned the anonymous donor. Former anonymous donor. Charlotte sipped her champagne. The board insisted on transparency, remember? The past year had brought changes to Ashton Industries. The merger with Sterling Technologies doubled their reach. Nathaniel's charitable programs moved into the light, inspiring other companies to follow suit. Victoria had taken an extended vacation in Europe. Charlotte's career transformed too. She launched a new series focusing on corporate responsibility, highlighting companies that made real differences in their communities. Her first piece featured a janitor's wife who beat cancer thanks to an executive who believed in second chances. Remember our first contract? Nathaniel asked. Page 17? How could I forget? Marriage certificate, subsection B. Charlotte laughed. I should have read the fine print. I'm glad you didn't. They watched the party below. George the janitor danced with his wife Annie, her cancer in remission. Ellen, the retired secretary, showed photos of her grandchildren to board members. Sarah orchestrated everything with her usual efficiency, but now she smiled more. The elevator dinged. Charlotte turned to see her father step onto the rooftop, clutching a worn newspaper. Dad, you're early. Couldn't miss my daughter's real wedding rehearsal dinner. He hugged her tight. Brought you something. The newspaper was his last edition before the family paper closed. The headline read, Local Girl Dreams Big. Below it, a photo showed teenage Charlotte at her first journalism awards ceremony. You always said the best stories come from unexpected places, her father said. Guess you proved that,